Hey guys, what's up? Alex Scott here with Consordini.com coming at you with another quick mixing tutorial. Today we're going to be taking a look at something that it seems simple at first glance, but is definitely a little bit more complex and nuanced than you might think, and that is mixing bass guitars. Now, the track that we have pulled up today is a real simple kind of a pop modern country thing that we did for a music library a couple of years ago, but it's a great kind of example of just a situation where there's not a ton of elements going on. We just have a couple of guitar tracks, drums, and bass. But you really want the bass to be present and growly and deep and all these things. But you don't want it to stand out too much because it might end up making your track a little bit muddy if you get too carried away. So that's why I picked this one and kind of wanted to run through it. Now, a lot of the techniques and stuff that I'm going to be talking about and using can be done with any style of music. Like I said, this is kind of a modern pop country rock type thing, but this could apply to kind of any flavor of rock, any flavor of country, blues, anything like that, more kind of organic, I guess, Western music. If I were mixing bass on like a hip hop or rap tune or something, I might approach it a little bit differently, but usually those kinds of music you're using synth bass or Moog bass or something like that. So this is more specific to bass guitars. Okay, so let's go ahead and take a listen to our track. Now, everything else is pretty decently mixed. The guitars are, the drums are, we've got verbs and compression on everything, but the bass is currently totally untreated. So we can just hear that's the gist of the track. And you can hear, the bass is in there, but it doesn't have a ton of a voice. It doesn't have really great presence. I'm having to ride the fader all the way up to +10 in order to really get it to where you can even hear it clearly. So what are some things that we can do to bring our bass out more? Well, the first thing I can tell you that you don't want to do is this. Okay, if we open up our EQ here, you don't want to just go adding a bunch of low end. Okay, that's the number one mistake that I see is guys will either take like a low shelf and do this kind of a thing, or they're, even worse, they'll have kind of a typical bell like this or an EQ peak and just try to go, okay, I'm going to add a ton of 80 hertz. That's not what you want to do. Why do we not want to do that? Well, if you think about it, 80 hertz in any of this low end stuff is that's right in the realm of where the actual notes on a bass guitar are. Okay, so when you play the open low E string on a bass guitar, that's sitting right around somewhere in the neighborhood of 30, 32 hertz, something like that. I don't remember the exact frequency, but that note itself, the fundamental pitch of the note, is at something like 32 or 33 hertz. So if I start to go boosting down there, all of a sudden at 80 hertz, 80 hertz might be a G sharp on a bass guitar. And so you start to boost 80 hertz, suddenly all you're going to do is make that G sharp louder than everything else, okay? Because if you look at how sound actually works and kind of the harmonic structure of everything, because of the nature of the instrument, you have the fundamental pitches down there in those frequency ranges. So when you start boosting and cutting specific frequencies, suddenly you're making certain notes louder than other notes. You're not really bringing anything to the party in terms of the tone of the instrument, okay? So we have to go about making it sound meatier and thicker in some other ways. Another thing, and this also seems incredibly counterintuitive, is that one thing I really like to do is I will actually high pass my bass guitar right at around the high 20s, okay? So right there, that's 28 hertz. Now, you're not going to be able to hear this particularly, but what it's going to do is it's taking those very lowest subharmonic frequencies of like finger noise and stuff like that, and it's going to lessen those a little bit. Also, kick drums have a tendency of resonating down into those extreme lower extensions of the frequency spectrum. And so sometimes if you have muddiness between your bass guitar and your kick drum, just cleaning a little bit out of, I would never push it past 40, again, because you're going to start to remove notes, but leave it down here around, 25 hertz. You're not going to hear it sounding any different. All it's going to do is just clean things up a little bit more in that extreme low extension of your mix. Make your kick drum stand out a little bit better, help set separation between your bass and your kick. So if we just solo our bass here. Okay, so we've got the instrument has a pretty good even tone. There's a good amount of grit and top end to it. So what are some things that we can do to make it really rich and full sounding and with tons of low end without this problem of boosting and cutting specific frequencies? Well, the first thing I'll reach for is some kind of saturation. Okay, so in Softube Console One, this plugin that we're using alongside this controller that you see me grabbing here, this is just called Drive, and then you have Character. You can do this with really any type of distortion plugin. Basically, what it's doing as I'm driving, it's emulating transformer saturation, so like analog saturation, or a little bit of not distortion per se, but a tiny bit. And then as I push this character negative, it's going to help lush out that low end a little bit. Negative in this particular circumstance is what we call third order harmonics. I won't get too complicated or in depth into what that exactly is, but suffice to say, if you listen, that you can hear it saturating more, and then as we pull the character, you can hear it just makes things a little bit richer, okay? So that's the first thing I would do. So already, if we put that back in the mix. Already we have a lot more definition in the bass just by adding a little bit of saturation and cleaning out those extremely low end frequencies. So again, let's listen. Let's take Console One off. It's very anemic. Put it back on. Suddenly it's richer and fuller. So saturation is a great solution for this problem. Another thing to make your bass a little bit more present, and this is a tonal thing, you can, because the bass is never going to have frequencies up here. Okay, see where I'm up in the 2 to 3K range? We're beyond the range of notes on a bass guitar at that point. Where we are into, though, is that's where all of our finger noise is. Okay, that's where that grit, that sparkle on the top end of the strings is all up in there. So we can boost that. And because of the nature of the instrument, you know, we can even go pretty far with it, do 7, 8, 10 dB boost. And it's not going to sound too weird. There's not a ton of content there because it's a bass guitar. It's mostly those low fundamental frequencies, but it is going to help to bring out some grit. So again, now that we've added a bit of top end grit, it's helping it to be a little bit more present, okay? And the last thing that I definitely always do is a little bit of compression, okay? I personally favor optical type compressors. So we're going to go with an LA2A, okay? A very famous compressor on the bass in this particular circumstance. It's also a very simple compressor. You just pretty much tell it how much to compress. And that's going to even things out. It's going to make your bottom end and top end really nice and consistent between one another, and it's going to make the performance, the dynamics of the performance, really even. I don't want to do too much gain reduction. We're doing around 3 dB peak, maybe a little more. So now, we've got a really nice, present, full spectrum bass sound. Now, the last thing that I want to talk about is if none of the compression, this kind of intelligent EQing, not boosting the low end, and instead either boosting mid and top presence, cleaning out some of those extremely low frequencies that you don't need, that are below the fundamental notes, saturation, all these things I just talked about, that's still not quite doing it for you. What I will definitely do from time to time is I will just duplicate this whole track, okay? This bass was originally recorded direct, so just cable into a preamp, no amp or anything. But people do record through bass amps for a reason. So I'm going to duplicate this whole track. Okay, we've got a perfect replication of the whole track here. And I'm going to take off, because it duplicated the console one as well. We're just going to reload that. So now it's going to be set neutrally. Okay, so we're undoing all the settings. So they're still on our first track. So our first track still sounds exactly as we just got it sounding. Okay, but now we have this clone track. That's just the dry bass signal again. Now I will take this, and if you've got a situation where you can reamp into an actual bass amp, that's great. If not, I do use Bass Amp Room from Softube. Fabulous sounding bass amp emulator. Logic has some great bass amps built into it. Studio One also has some really great amp simulation going on. And then I personally really like these clean fat, okay? So basically all this is going for is we're going for a lot of bass boost, a lot of low end, and cutting out a lot of the mids and treble, and then limiting. Okay, there's a limiter built in here. And so we're doing some limiting as well. And then this particular amp sim has this tone thing for the DI, because we're actually blending between DI and amp in this plugin. But basically, it's more of a conceptual thing. So you can hear now with this plugin on, here's without, this is the DI'd signal, and then there's with the amp sim. So it's got a lot of sub bass to it. Okay, it's really making those ultra lows nice and enhanced, and then it's also getting a little bit of grit of a different flavor. It's not that finger grit, it's more of like a tube distortion kind of a grit. And now when we mix these two together, you always want to check your phase. We are in phase. So now if we listen to this with the track, that's nice. That's really nice. Now we've really got a big, thick, fat bass sound. So sometimes blending in either a real amp signal or something that's been run through an amp sim, blending that in, focusing your amp sim more on real sub bass, and then using your DI bass to bring out the brightness and the grit and the sparkle and the strings and all that, and the finger sound and all that kind of stuff. You know, now we can really play with, if we solo them again, all amp, and there's all DI, so you can really just blend the two to taste. That's more amp, or that's a little bit more DI. Yeah, so there you go. Nothing too crazy, nothing too complicated. We're not using all kinds of plugins. Really just a little bit of compression, maybe a little bit of saturation, some very basic EQing in the top end and mid-range. You know, that's really it. It's not, you know, again, mixing bass seems very simple at first, and from a certain perspective, it is, you know, it's not like vocal is where you're de-essing and writing the fader and a little bit of verb and then this delay and then a little bit of that delay and all, you know, all these different kinds of effects. It's usually just very simple things like EQ, compression, maybe an amp sim, maybe a little bit of saturation. But it's more about just knowing how to fine tune it. The low end of a mix is always the hardest to get right. And if you're starting with a really great bass sound that sits in its own world, you know, you'll usually find that your low end ends up really nice and clean. And if you feel like your low end is muddy, the first thing you want to look at is how your bass is mixed. Is there any extraneous weirdness going on in the low end of the bass guitar? And then also, how is that sitting in relation to the kick drum? Because you want really good, clear interplay between bass, and then you want the kick to kind of snap out in front of the bass when it's being hit. And that's going to give you really tight, clean, punchy low end. But how do you guys mix your basses? If you guys have any thoughts or tips or tricks, I would love to hear from you guys, hear how you guys approach this in the comments down below. Be sure to add your thoughts to the conversation. Again, my name is Alex Scott with Consordini.com. Thank you guys so much for watching the video. Hopefully you found it helpful. We will see you in the next one.